Lying, hypnotizing, gaslighting. Did Texas's serial killer whisperer and his questionable tactics ensnare an innocent man? I'm Matt Robeson. This is Beyond Politics, an amazing new podcast from journalist Maurice Chammah and the Marshall Project called Just Say You're Sorry, poses all of those questions that I reeled off at the beginning and ultimately asks, what's the price that we pay for a sense that we've closed the books when we might be closing them on the wrong page? Maurice Chammah is staff writer and the author of Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty, which won the 2019 J. Anthony Lukas Work-In-Progress Book Award, which also needs to be renamed for brevity. His work has been published by The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. Maurice, welcome back to Beyond Politics.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Your podcast is riveting. It's really terrific. I urge people to check it out. There are so many stories of potential innocence out there. You encounter them all the time in the course of your work. Why did you want to tell this story?
So I do encounter in my work a lot of innocence claims from people in prison, a lot of people who say I was convicted, but I did not commit this crime. Frequently, I find these individual cases that seem to speak to larger policy issues in terms of how the criminal justice system functions. They go beyond the individual case and can tell us something larger. So this is the case of Larry Driscoll that I tell in the podcast. Larry Driscoll confessed to the crime that sent him to prison. And this is a subset of wrongful convictions. And I think it's one that people have a hard time still to this day wrapping their mind around. How could you possibly confess to a crime that you didn't commit? There was no evidence against Larry Driscoll beyond his own confession and plenty of reasons to think that he did not commit the crime. So it was a good kind of case study to understand, how does this happen to somebody?
Tell us a little bit about James Holland,
the detective at the center of the story who elicited this purported false confession and who found Larry Driscoll in the first place, is a Texas Ranger named James Holland. I think even if you didn't grow up in Texas, you have heard of the Texas Rangers. We felt that was really key to telling the story of James Holland and how he came to get Larry Driscoll for this murder. He developed a reputation for being very good at getting people to admit to things, and that began on the side of the road. He pulls someone over and has the kind of sixth sense that there's drugs or guns in the car. And next thing you know, he's got someone to admit it, and that person is under arrest. And then over time, he's given the ability to work on murder cases. So there's this sort of superhuman ability to use the kind of gift of language to convince and persuade people. Now, James Holland, he'd become famous in the case of a couple of different serial killers where he had gone into prison and gotten these serial killers to confess to dozens of crimes that they had not confessed to previously. But it turned out that there was this other side to his work where the people he was trying to interrogate and convince were not already in prison as serial killers. They were men living their lives. And that is the case of Larry Driscoll.
You take us through the process that leads to potentially a tragic miscarriage of justice. One of the ways you do that is through Holland's own recordings. What was it like for you listening to these recordings?
They are riveting. They're extraordinary. And a big part of the work of making the podcast was essentially just editing this audio that we already had into a sort of tight frame so that people could digest it in 30 minutes or an hour. It is an immersive experience because when James Holland, the Texas Ranger, approaches Larry Driscoll, you can really hear in the audio that Driscoll has no idea what this Texas Ranger is talking about, no idea that he is about to be questioned about a murder. And so then you listen as he says, okay, you're saying maybe I was a witness to a crime. I don't know about that, but I guess I'll get in this truck with you and go to the sheriff's office. And then you watch you listen as Holland just slowly turns up the pressure. And as he turns up the pressure, Driscoll starts to construct little memories or starts to have these little epiphanies of, I guess I maybe was in that area of Fort Worth that you're describing. I guess I do have a memory of that. And then you hear how Holland is interpreting what Driscoll is saying to mean that he was withholding things and that Holland has now gotten him to reveal that he was actually at the scene of the crime. And so it's this dance between these two men where there's so much going on psychologically. And I remember feeling very immersed, but also thinking, I don't have the tools to fully understand what I'm hearing. So part of the project was also bringing these recordings to psychologists, to experts on confessions and interrogations, so that they could help translate for me, the lay person, and then eventually the listener, listener, the audience, what is beneath the surface of this kind of dance between these two men? What is going on psychologically? How is each man making his decisions about what he's going to say next?
Underlying it all is this seeming determination to be helpful, to try to solve James Holland's problem for him. It really, the former FBI hostage negotiator, Chris Voss, talks about using this technique in hostage negotiations, trying to make your counterparty solve your problem for you, not filling in too much, letting them start to fill in ideas and do your work for you. And you can almost see that happening.
Yeah, and you can hear when Larry Driscoll isn't giving Holland what he wants, that occasionally he'll say, I guess I was at that intersection. I used to drive a van and there's a van in this case, but no, that woman doesn't look familiar. That woman being the victim in the case, the woman who was murdered, who we can get to. He's at a certain point, he's really not giving Holland much, and Holland starts to have to do the work for himself. But then when he starts to ask questions, hypothetically, if this is the way that this murder had happened, hypothetically, how would you have gone about doing that? And you're not committing to confession, you're not admitting to anything, but let's just hypothetically have you, and that word hypothetically shows up repeatedly in the transcript, in the audio. And and it is very visual, because when you use a word like hypothetically, you're inviting someone to imagine for themselves something that happened. And so the listener can imagine the scenarios that are being discussed around this possible murderer. I'll jump back and say that it was a woman named Bobby Sue Hill. She was doing sex work in Fort Worth, a really seedy part of Fort Worth, where I think it was not uncommon for people to disappear, for people to be abducted. It was very dangerous. And she disappears, but then her body is found in a rural part of Texas. It's about an hour west of Fort Worth, not far from where Larry Driscoll himself lives. So the investigation is all happening in this rural community, but the victim is from Fort Worth. You can almost hear Larry Driscoll starting to dip into this hypothetical language and imagine for himself, if he had killed this woman, how he would have gone about doing it. Never mind that he didn't. Just we all have this experience where we have memories and things we can concretely say happened, and then we have our imagination and things that we know didn't happen.
I do want to talk a little bit about the victim in this case, because if you had to pick a genre on Apple Podcasts, they might put it in true crime, but that's not what you're doing. If anything, it seems like you're subverting a lot of genres that we're familiar with for entertainment in America. And this is just me. It feels to me like you're subverting the true crime genre, you're subverting the detective genre, and you're subverting the courtroom genre. And one of the ways is in true crime, there's a sort of prurient interest in the victim.
I don't think we thought about it as subverting, but we understood. So my day job is at the Marshall Project, which is a news outlet that covers the criminal justice system. And so everything that we do, my work entirely, is focused on understanding the system part of it. The hope was to blend some aspects of the true crime genre with this sort of zoomed out style of criminal justice reporting that helps you understand, why did things play out the way that they did in this case? And what does that tell us about the larger system and the things that we can perhaps fix? For example, we spend a lot of time talking about the particular aspects of the interrogation that are currently being debated in state legislatures. So, for example, the Texas Ranger James Holland frequently lies to Larry Driscoll. He says things that are just simply not true. Those play a key role in leading Driscoll down the road towards a confession. Once the Ranger has lied and said, wow, there's proof that you and your license plate number were in this time and place, that leads Larry Driscoll to imagine himself at the scene of the crime and get closer to the point of confession. It's like a first step down that runway. But at the same time, I had listened to plenty of podcasts that I felt did a disservice to the victim's family, that sort of told their story without adequately reaching out to that family. As I started talking to the family, I learned that there was a much richer picture here, that she had been a mother of 5, that she had struggled with substance abuse, and then her husband, the father of these children, had died in a car accident. So there were all these different layers of tragedy surrounding the case. I think that's up to her family to decide whether we treated her memory with adequate honor and dignity, but we spent a lot of time trying to do that.
It really sets up what feels like the heart of what you're doing in this show, which is helping all of us to grapple with our sense of justice and kind of, as I set up at the beginning, the price of justice. As a member of society, I want the Texas Ranger to get their man.
Right.
But I also want it to be the right man. Often in our fiction, we valorize the crusading law enforcement official, the attorney, the a few good men cross-examination, where you get Colonel Jessup to say the thing that he doesn't want to say. And here we have James Holland getting Larry Driscoll to say not only the thing he doesn't want to say, but the thing that isn't true. And it's a miscarriage of justice.
The true crime boom in terms of culture, in terms of podcasts, TV, Netflix, streaming series, et cetera, has coincided with a very tragic rise in cold cases. So there are really more cold cases today than there used to be. The rate at which police solve homicides has been dropping since 50 years ago. And so there are more cases going unsolved, which is just creating a larger and larger backlog. And part of the thinking behind this podcast was to go deep on one case, in a case where detectives were using this huge array of questionable, controversial techniques and tactics to get their man in order to get members of the public who control what happens ultimately through their elected representatives to really start thinking through what are we comfortable with as a society to use the most out there unregulated forms of law enforcement techniques, whether it's in the interrogation room or hypnosis, which we haven't talked about, but plays a role in this case.
The first episode, you note that you have innocence lawyers on speed dial. You're unusual in that respect. You encounter stories of potential innocence and miscarriages of justice everywhere. You also report on crime and you encounter people who are very likely guilty of doing some pretty terrible things all the time. Does all of this experience that you have in the course of reporting this story, does that make you see innocence and flaws in the system everywhere? Or does it make you see overall a system that tends to work everywhere?
90+% of my work, my journalism, isn't about cases where people are potentially innocent, that they really are much of the time guilty. And the question often is not, did they do it? It is, what is justice in this case when it comes to the punishment? So for example, should they be sentenced to death? Should they be executed?
Right.
Or should they spend, or let's say that the crime is much more minor. They've been arrested selling drugs, say, or shoplifting. Should they get probation and an opportunity at a second chance, or should they go to prison for 5 years and lose touch with their kids or their parents and get out of prison totally unable to really operate in the world the way they had before and just utterly devastated and traumatized by that experience in prison? So there are these questions around justice. These are ultimately very subjective calls. Sometimes need a really inviting yarn to draw you into these bigger questions.
And that's why I think I can so wholeheartedly recommend the show, because it does that. The podcast, Just Say You're Sorry. It's from the Marshall Project. You can find it. You can Google it under the Marshall Project, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts. And Maurice Chammah, thanks so much for being with us on Beyond Politics.
Thanks so much for having me. Really great to be here.